Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can lead to the most unexpected encounters. But what happens when a good deed brings someone face to face with a part of their past they'd rather forget? Stay tuned to find out, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Daniel Reeves adjusted the straps of his worn-out backpack as he walked along the edge of the highway, his boots scuffing against the cracked pavement. The weight on his shoulders wasn't just from the bag, it was from years of battles, both overseas and at home. He had fought for his country, given everything, and yet here he was, wandering the streets, surviving on scraps and restless nights on park benches. His body bore the scars of war, but it was the invisible wounds, the loneliness, the regret, the suffocating feeling of irrelevance that hurt the most. He kept his head on a swivel, not just out of habit from years in the service, but because life on the streets demanded it. People liked to pretend he wasn't there, that he was just another shadow blending into the cityscape, but every so often someone made eye contact. Some with pity, others with suspicion. He hated both. Up ahead, a sleek black sedan sat motionless on the side of the road. The back tire was flat, a jagged piece of debris sticking out from the rubber like a wound refusing to close. Daniel's instinct kicked in before his mind could stop him. Without hesitation, he veered off his path and approached the car. He didn't expect gratitude. He didn't expect a reward. He didn't even expect conversation. That wasn't why he did things like this. Some habits died hard, and fixing problems, solving situations, was embedded deep in him. Dropping his backpack onto the curb, he knelt beside the wheel and inspected the damage. Whoever owned the car hadn't even attempted to change it. The spare tire was still locked in its compartment, the jack untouched. Rich types, he thought, the kind of people who probably never had to get their hands dirty. He set to work, moving with the efficiency of a man who had been through worse situations. Within minutes, he had the jack positioned, the lug nuts loosened. As he pried the damaged tire off, he heard the unmistakable sound of a car window rolling down. "Didn't ask for help," a voice said, clipped and authoritative. Daniel froze. His grip tightened on the tire iron, not out of fear, but out of something deeper. That voice. It was familiar, too familiar. He looked up slowly, and behind the tinted glass of the luxury sedan, he saw a face he never thought he'd see again. Colonel Travis Monroe. A man who once commanded him, a man who once decided his fate, a man who had walked away without looking back. The moment stretched between them, thick with unspoken words and buried history. Daniel had envisioned many scenarios where he might cross paths with someone from his old life. None of them had played out like this. Monroe's expression was unreadable, a mask of indifference that hadn't changed since their last encounter. "Appreciate it," he said, his tone suggesting the opposite. Daniel swallowed hard, pushing past the lump in his throat. He had expected a lot of things from today, but not this. Not him. Daniel exhaled slowly, steadying himself as he stood up from the flat tire, wiping his dirty hands against the worn fabric of his jeans. His mind raced, but his body remained still, trained by years of discipline not to show weakness, not to let emotions crack through the surface. Colonel Monroe. He had once been the highest authority in Daniel's life, the man who gave orders, who decided who stayed and who went, who walked the line between leader and executioner in the unforgiving world of war. And now he sat in the back of a luxury sedan, staring at Daniel like he was a stray dog that had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. Monroe's eyes flickered with recognition, but his face remained neutral, his jaw set in that same hardened way Daniel remembered from deployments. "You always this quick to fix other people's problems, Reeves?" His tone was the same as it had always been, sharp, cold, just shy of condescending. Daniel felt something burn in his chest, but he swallowed it down. "Old habits," he muttered. "Some of us don't forget how to be useful." If the words struck a nerve, Monroe didn't show it. Instead, he reached into the breast pocket of his crisp, expensive-looking jacket and pulled out a neatly folded bill. "For your trouble," he said, extending it through the open window. Daniel didn't even glance at the money. Instead, he focused on Monroe's face, searching for something, anything, that hinted at recognition beyond the surface. "I don't need your money." Monroe's expression didn't change. He simply let the bill dangle between his fingers for a moment before withdrawing it and tucking it back into his pocket. "Suit yourself." The driver, a man who had been silent up until now, adjusted the rearview mirror but kept his eyes forward, waiting for a signal. Monroe gave a barely perceptible nod, and just like that, the interaction was over. The tinted window rolled back up with mechanical precision, sealing Monroe back inside his world of wealth and detachment. The car pulled away, its tires crunching against the pavement, leaving Daniel standing in its wake. A bitter taste settled in his mouth. He hadn't expected a reunion. He hadn't expected gratitude. But he also hadn't expected to feel this invisible, like he was nothing more than a nameless stranger who happened to be in the right place at the right time. He watched the taillights disappear down the road, hands clenched into fists at his sides. It wasn't the first time someone had driven off without looking back. But it was the first time it had hurt like this. Daniel stood there, staring down the empty stretch of road where Monroe's car had disappeared. The moment had come and gone, as fleeting as a gunshot in the distance, but the impact lingered. His heartbeat had steadied, but something deeper, something old and unresolved, twisted inside him. He wanted to tell himself that it didn't matter, that it was just another car, another man too busy with his world to acknowledge a life he had once held power over. But that wasn't true. He hadn't seen Monroe in years, not since the day everything changed, that day when Daniel had stood at attention, waiting for orders that never came, waiting for a commander's word that never arrived. The last time he had seen Monroe, the man had turned his back on him, and now history had repeated itself. Except this time, it wasn't war keeping them apart. It was silence. Daniel shook his head and grabbed his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder. He knew better than to dwell on things like this. Regret, longing, hope. Those things didn't put food in his stomach or a roof over his head. The city lights flickered in the distance, a constant hum of life that didn't care whether he existed or not. He started walking, not out of purpose, but because standing still felt like surrender. The streets weren't friendly at night, but they were predictable. The underpasses, the bus stops, the quiet alleyways behind closed businesses, these were his world now. He moved through them with an instinct that only those who had learned to survive carried with them. At the corner of 9th and Langley, he passed a convenience store, its buzzing neon sign reflecting off the pavement in sickly colors. Inside, a young clerk barely looked up from his phone as Daniel stepped in. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a stark contrast to the outside world. Daniel walked past the aisles, scanning the shelves with the careful eye of someone who needed to make every dollar count. He grabbed a bottled water and a protein bar before heading to the counter. "Well?" the clerk asked, his tone flat. Daniel nodded and dug into his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills. As he waited for change, the television mounted behind the counter caught his eye. The volume was low, but the news ticker scrolled steadily across the screen. Defense contractor Monroe Industries secures multi-billion-dollar military contract. CEO Travis Monroe declines comment on future expansion plans. Daniel's fingers curled slightly around the change as he stared at the screen. So that's where he landed. Of course, Monroe had always been the kind of man who rose through the ranks, who played the long game while others got left behind. It made sense. What didn't make sense was why Daniel still cared. He turned, stepping back into the night, back into the world that had already moved on without him. Daniel sat on the worn-out bench at the edge of a gas station parking lot, absently chewing on the protein bar he had bought. The sounds of the city moved around him, a constant hum of passing cars, muffled conversations, and the occasional distant siren. He had learned to blend into the background, to make himself invisible in a world that barely acknowledged his existence. But tonight he wasn't invisible. Not to himself, not after seeing Monroe. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his calloused hands together. The past had a way of creeping up when you least expected it, dragging you back to places you'd rather forget. He had spent years trying to move forward, to focus on survival, to convince himself that what happened in the military was just another chapter of a book that was already closed. Yet, one encounter on the side of the road, one cold stare from the other side of a tinted window, and suddenly that chapter didn't feel so distant anymore. Daniel reached into his pocket, pulling out the crumpled receipt from the convenience store. He smoothed it out on his knee, letting his fingers trace over the faded ink, his mind elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about the protein bar, the bottle of water, or the change he had gotten back. He was thinking about that name he saw on the TV screen. Monroe Industries. Colonel Monroe, CEO Monroe. Daniel clenched his jaw. Of course, the man had found his way into money, into power. He had always been a step ahead, always known how to maneuver, how to make things work in his favor. What about the ones who were left behind? Daniel scoffed, shaking his head at himself. What did it matter? He had spent years convincing himself that he didn't care, that there was no point in wondering about the what-ifs, no point in thinking about the men who moved on while others got left in the dirt. Then why did it sting? Why did it feel like something had been ripped open inside him? He looked up as a car pulled into the gas station, its headlights briefly washing over him before it rolled to a stop by the pumps. A man in a suit stepped out, checking his phone as he absent-mindedly waited for the tank to fill. Just another person in a rush, another cog in the machine that never stopped turning. Daniel let his gaze drift past the man, back toward the skyline, back toward the city that swallowed people whole and didn't look back. He had to let it go. He had to keep moving. But even as he told himself that, he knew the past wasn't done with him yet. Daniel never stayed in one place too long, but something about tonight weighed him down like an anchor. He sat on the cold pavement behind the gas station, his back resting against the brick wall, knees drawn up. The city buzzed around him, but he wasn't really there, not in his mind. His hands rested on his lap, fingers idly running over the frayed edges of his sleeves. It had been a long time since he had let his thoughts wander back to the military, to the men he served with, to the way things ended. The life he had before felt like another world, a place he could no longer reach. But after seeing Monroe, it was as if the door had cracked open again, whether he wanted it to or not. A few feet away, a stray dog rummaged through an overturned trash bin, sniffing out scraps. Daniel watched the animal, feeling a strange sort of kinship, surviving day to day, scavenging for what you could, avoiding the wrong kind of attention. Yeah, he understood that life well. A car pulled up to the curb, the low hum of its engine breaking through his thoughts. Daniel didn't look up at first. People came and went, cars idled, deals were made in the shadows. None of it concerned him. But then a door opened. Footsteps, purposeful, directed. Reeves. Daniel tensed. That voice. He looked up. Standing in front of him, dressed in the kind of tailored suit that screamed money, was Monroe. The colonel. The CEO. The man who had driven away without a second thought was suddenly right here, staring down at him with that same unreadable expression. Daniel pushed himself up slowly, his body stiff from sitting on the cold ground. He met Monroe's gaze, searching for any hint of the man he once knew. Monroe exhaled, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "Didn't take me long to find you." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "Didn't realize you were looking." Monroe studied him for a moment, then motioned toward the car behind him. "Get in. We need to talk." Daniel let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "That's rich. You roll past me like I don't exist, and now you want to talk?" Monroe's jaw tightened. "I didn't expect to see you, and I sure as hell didn't expect to owe you one." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "You don't owe me anything." "Where you're wrong," Monroe said. "Just get in the car." Daniel stared at him, considering his options. A part of him wanted to walk away, to turn his back, just like Monroe had done to him years ago. But another part of him, the part that still carried the weight of unfinished business, wanted to hear what the colonel had to say. With a slow, deliberate breath, Daniel stepped forward. He got in the car. The car's interior smelled of leather and something faintly expensive, the kind of scent that reminded Daniel he didn't belong here. He sank into the seat cautiously, his back stiff against the smooth surface, muscles tensed as the door shut beside him. Monroe slid into the seat across from him, his presence commanding the space with the same quiet authority he had always carried. The years hadn't softened him. If anything, he looked even more carved from stone, his sharp eyes assessing Daniel as if he were still giving orders in a war zone. The driver pulled away from the curb, the city lights flickering through the tinted windows. Daniel stayed silent, waiting. He had no intention of making this easy for Monroe. Monroe sighed, adjusting his cuffs. "You look like hell." "Huh." Daniel smirked, his fingers tightening around the strap of his worn-out backpack. "Yeah? You look like money." Monroe's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough to make Daniel's stomach twist with old memories. Memories of standing at attention while Monroe paced the barracks, issuing commands with the kind of certainty that made men follow without question. But this wasn't then, and Daniel wasn't a soldier anymore. Monroe leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "I want to offer you a job." Daniel snorted, shaking his head. "You serious?" "Dead serious. I didn't think you were in the charity business." "I'm not." Monroe's voice was calm but firm. "This isn't charity, this is business." Daniel narrowed his eyes. What kind of business drags a homeless vet off the street and into a backseat negotiation? And Monroe studied him, measuring his words before he spoke. "I run a private security firm. High-level contracts. Government. Adjacent. We handle jobs that require a certain skill set. Ones you still have." Daniel let out a slow breath. He wasn't stupid. He knew the type of work Monroe was talking about. Black ops, gray areas, the kind of security that didn't show up on official reports. He had done enough of that before, back when he was still someone who mattered. "You've got other guys for that?" Daniel said finally. "Ones who aren't sleeping under bridges?" Monroe's jaw tensed. "I need someone I can trust. And whether you believe it or not, that still means something." Daniel let the words hang between them. Trust. That word had lost its meaning a long time ago. He exhaled, shaking his head. "Why me?" Monroe didn't blink. "Because you saved my ass on that roadside. Because I know you're still capable, and because you deserve better than this." Daniel swallowed, looking away. The city blurred past outside the window, but his mind was stuck in the past, in the years that had brought him here. He had spent so long surviving, he had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted. And that scared him more than anything. Daniel stared at Monroe, his jaw tightening as he tried to piece together the real reason for this sudden offer. The the CO now, wasn't the kind of man to extend a hand unless there was something in it for him. That much hadn't changed. The car moved steadily through the city, the hum of the tires barely noticeable inside the insulated luxury of the cabin. Monroe sat back, waiting, giving Daniel time to process. Finally, Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. "You say I deserve better, but you didn't seem too concerned about that back on the roadside." Monroe exhaled through his nose, his gaze steady. "You caught me off guard." Daniel let out a dry chuckle. "Didn't know a man like you could be caught off guard." "I didn't expect to see you like that," Monroe admitted. "I thought you'd moved on, made something of yourself." Daniel looked away, watching the streetlights flicker past. "Yeah? Well, so did I." Monroe was silent for a beat, then said, "I need someone with your skills, not just the training, the instincts, someone I can rely on when things get complicated." Daniel turned back to him, eyes narrowing. "And what exactly is complicated in your world, Monroe?" Monroe shifted slightly, his fingers tapping against his knee. "It's corporate work, mostly. High-profile clients, asset protection, Occasionally things go sideways. That's where I need someone who doesn't just follow a playbook, someone who knows how to adapt. Daniel studied him, trying to read between the lines. So you need a fixer. You could call it that, Daniel huffed, shaking his head. There are a dozen guys out there with better resumes and cleaner records. Why me? Monroe's expression hardened. Because I know what you're capable of. Because I've seen you in the worst situations, and I know you don't fold under pressure, and because I trust you. Daniel barked out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Trust? That's rich coming from you. Monroe's face darkened slightly, but he didn't flinch. You think I abandoned you. Daniel felt his fingers curl into fists at his sides. Didn't you? Monroe's jaw tightened. It wasn't that simple. It never is. The tension between them was thick, filled with years of unspoken words and unanswered questions. Monroe sighed, rubbing his temple briefly before meeting Daniel's gaze again. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking if you want a way out of this life. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. There was something dangerously tempting about the offer, like an open door leading to a room he thought was locked forever. But the problem with open doors was that you never knew what was waiting on the other side. The car wove through the city, taking turns that felt deliberate, purposeful, like Monroe wasn't just driving Daniel around, he was guiding him somewhere. Daniel felt the weight of the moment settle deep in his gut, a slow burn that wasn't quite anger but something close to it. He had been down this road before, not literally, but figuratively, the promise of something better, something steady, a chance to crawl out of the hole he'd been left in, but every time it came with a price. You haven't said no, Monroe observed. Daniel smirked, leaning his head back against the seat. Haven't said yes either. Monroe nodded as if he had expected that response. I get it. You don't trust me. You probably have good reason. But Daniel turned his head to look at him, his expression flat. Yeah, I do. Monroe exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw. All right, let's be honest then. You feel like I left you behind. Daniel let out a short, bitter chuckle. Feel like? No, I know you did. Monroe's fingers drummed lightly on the armrest, a small tell that he wasn't as unaffected as he wanted to appear. That wasn't my call. Daniel's body stiffened before he could stop himself. That's convenient. Monroe's gaze sharpened. I fought for you, Reeves, but you know how it works. Some decisions don't belong to men in the field. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to breathe through the anger that stirred inside him. And you didn't think maybe I deserved to hear that back then? Instead of being left in the dark, tossed aside like I didn't matter? Monroe was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more controlled. I made mistakes. Daniel scoffed. Yeah, no kidding. Monroe didn't react to the jab. Instead, he shifted slightly, eyes scanning Daniel like he was assessing damage. Look, I'm not here to justify the past. You can carry that grudge if you want. I won't tell you not to. But the fact is, I'm offering you something now. You want to keep sleeping under bridges? Fine. But I have a way out for you, if you're willing to take it. Daniel let out a slow breath, looking past Monroe to the blurred cityscape outside the window. The offer wasn't just about a job. It was a test, a challenge, maybe even an apology. Monroe didn't know how to say out loud, and that made it dangerous. Because Daniel wasn't sure if he wanted to take the offer or throw it back in Monroe's face. But what scared him most was that, for the first time in a long time, he actually wanted to consider it. The car slowed as it approached a high-rise building, sleek and modern, its glass windows reflecting the city lights like fragments of something unreachable. Daniel recognized the type, a corporate fortress, the kind that belonged to men like Monroe, men who had traded battlefields for boardrooms without missing a step. The driver pulled up to the entrance, and Monroe didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open, stepping out like he belonged there. And maybe he did. Daniel, however, sat still. His fingers tapped absently against his knee as he stared at the polished glass doors ahead. This was the moment. If he stepped out of the car, he was walking into Monroe's world. If he stayed put, he could disappear back into the city like this night had never happened. Monroe turned, resting a hand on the open door, watching him. "You coming, or are we playing this game all night?" Daniel sighed through his nose, grabbing his backpack and swinging the strap over his shoulder. His boots hit the pavement as he climbed out, shutting the door behind him with a little more force than necessary. Monroe smirked, but didn't comment. Instead, he led the way inside, the glass doors parting smoothly. The lobby was vast, all marble and steel, a place designed to make people feel small. A woman at the front desk glanced up, giving Monroe a polite nod. "Mr. Monroe." "Evening, Sarah," Monroe replied without breaking stride. Daniel followed, feeling out of place in his worn-out jacket, his boots scuffed from too many miles. He wondered how many sets of eyes were subtly tracking him. Security cameras catching every move, people silently questioning what someone like him was doing in a place like this. They stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut with a soft hum. Monroe pressed a button and they began their ascent. "Before you start thinking it," Monroe said, breaking the silence, "this isn't about pity." Daniel scoffed. "Yeah, feels like it." Monroe glanced at him unamused. "You think I tracked down every guy who used to serve under me? I don't have time for that, Reeves. I came looking for you because I need someone I can count on." Daniel crossed his arms. "Plenty of ex-military guys looking for work. Why me?" Monroe hesitated for half a beat. "Because I know you won't let things slide." Daniel frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Monroe exhaled through his nose, shifting slightly. "It means I need someone who won't just follow orders blindly, someone who knows when to push back, and someone who understands what's at stake." Daniel studied him. There it was. The part Monroe hadn't said yet. "This job of yours," Daniel said slowly, "there's more to it than security work, isn't there?" Monroe met his gaze head-on. "Yeah, there is." The elevator chimed, the doors slid open, and Daniel knew he had just stepped into something bigger than he had ever imagined. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a dimly lit conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. The skyline stretched endlessly, glittering with thousands of lights, each one a different life moving forward without him. Daniel stepped out slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. Monroe walked ahead, unbothered, like he had already decided how this night would end. Daniel wasn't so sure. Inside, the room was sterile, professional, too clean for comfort. A long table stretched across the center, sleek black leather chairs tucked neatly in place. At the far end, a single file sat waiting, its manila edges sharp against the dark wood. Monroe gestured toward a chair. "Sit." Daniel didn't move. "I don't like surprises." Monroe smirked, folding his arms. "You never did." Daniel finally stepped forward, sliding into the seat with reluctance. He let his fingers drum against the edge of the table, waiting for Monroe to start talking. Instead, Monroe slid the file across the table. "Open it." Daniel hesitated. He didn't like this, not the secrecy, not the vague promises, but against his better judgment, he flipped the folder open. Inside was a photograph. A man in his late 40s, sharp suit, sharp smile, the kind of guy who made millions off of other people's misery. His name was stamped in bold beneath the image. Randall Kessler. Daniel frowned. Who is he? Monroe's jaw tensed. Someone who makes people disappear? People who get in the way? Daniel leaned back. And? Monroe sat across from him, steepling his fingers. And he's been hiring ex-military guys, people like you. But they're not doing security work, Daniel. They're cleaning up his messes. They don't ask questions. They don't leave witnesses. Daniel's stomach twisted. You're telling me this because... Monroe's gaze hardened. Because one of the guys he's trying to recruit is an old friend of yours. Daniel's throat went dry. He knew before Monroe even said the name. Elliot Graves. The weight of it hit him like a punch to the ribs. Elliot had been his closest friend in the service, the one guy who had never left him behind, even when everything else fell apart. If he was caught up in something like this... Daniel looked up, meeting Monroe's gaze. "What do you want me to do?" Monroe exhaled, leaning forward. "I want you to get close. I want you to find out what's going on before we're burying more good men." Silence stretched between them. This was it, the line in the sand. If he walked away, he'd go back to the streets, to the life he had built from scraps. But if he stepped forward, if he took this job, there was no turning back. Daniel closed the file slowly. His fingers tightened around the edges. "I'm in." Monroe nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then let's get to work."